All right, thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy to have you with us. Lots going on tonight. The week before Christmas, this past December, we thought that the president's national security advisor, his first national security advisor, Mike Flynn, was about to be sentenced. Flynn had a sentencing date. The prosecution and the defense had both filed submissions with the court giving the judge advice on what Mike Flynn's sentence should be. The appointed sentencing date arrived. Mike Flynn put on a suit, got in an SUV, turned up in court. All the lawyers were there on both sides. It was time for us all to figure out in open court that day how much time Mike Flynn was going to serve in prison, if he was going to get any prison time at all. But when it came time for Mike Flynn to be sentenced that day, in the end, he was not sentenced. It was sort of a shocking day in court, you might remember. Flynn, of course, had pled guilty to lying to investigators about his contacts with the Russian government while he was serving in the Trump transition. When he pled guilty, he became a cooperator, became a cooperating witness. The special counsel's office thereafter told the court repeatedly and officially that Flynn was a good cooperator, that he had cooperated extensively with them and helped them with multiple investigations. As such, the special counsel's office advised the judge in the Flynn case that despite the seriousness of Flynn's own confessed crimes, his cooperation had been so valuable to prosecutors that they believed the judge should give him little to no jail time. But nevertheless, a week before Christmas, last December, the judge in the Mike Flynn case balked. He told Flynn in open court that day that he could not hide, quote, his disdain, his disgust for Flynn's criminal conduct. In open court, he asked prosecutors from the special counsel's office if they had considered putting Mike Flynn on trial for treason, of all things. That was a shocking enough almost suggestion from the judge that later in the hearing, he actually walked that back in open court. But whatever that judge was looking at in terms of the evidence that we could see, also the sealed filings, any of the background information he had been provided in terms of Flynn's conduct and his cooperation. I mean, whatever the judge was seeing in the universe of information he had access to about Mike Flynn, it had that judge fired up enough that day in that courtroom that honestly, the real mercy that judge showed to Mike Flynn that day was when the judge repeatedly asked Flynn multiple times throughout the hearing if Flynn was really sure that he wanted to go ahead with this sentencing. The judge repeatedly went back to Flynn over the course of that hearing. Are you sure you want me to sentence you right now? Basically, are you sure today ought to be the day? You sure you don't want to maybe take some more time as a cooperating witness and see if there's anything else you might possibly be able to do for your country that might possibly mitigate the size of the book that I'm about to throw at you? For your crimes, which I've already said to your face in open court are crimes that disgust me? You sure you want to go ahead with this today? And it was interesting as a sort of moment of human drama. During that hearing that day, Flynn repeatedly rebuffed those, questions / suggestions from the judge, basically saying, no, Your Honor, no, you're good. Go ahead. I'm ready to be sentenced. Eventually, there was a little break where Flynn had time to have some quality time with his own lawyers. And after that break, Flynn did, I think, figure out what was going on. He did then concede to the judge that, yeah, maybe today wasn't good. Maybe it might be a good idea to take a little more time. And so the outcome of that hearing was that Mike Flynn was not sentenced. That was the week before Christmas. They put off his sentencing hearing sort of indefinitely. They put it off for months. He went back to being a cooperating witness after that shocking day in court. He's not even going to have a status conference on the state of his case until deep into next month. They put this thing off for a while. Go see what else you can do, sir. But in that case, the case of Mike Flynn and his aborted sentencing hearing, you might notice a little melody, a little tune that recurs, that is becoming sort of a theme song for all of the various cases, for all of the various people who have been charged and or pled guilty in the Russia investigation thus far. I think there is a theme that even us non-lawyers can recognize now when we look at these cases, when we can now see over time with all of these cases and all these dozens of indictments and dozens of defendants, we can now see a little bit of a recurring melody, a little theme that you can recognize in how judges react when they see evidence about the alleged or confessed crimes of the people who have been caught up thus far in this investigation. This investigation that centers around the special counsel's office, but has been dispersed into these multiple cases. We see how judges react when they get access to information about these defendants. We saw that with Flynn dramatically in December. We also see that theme all over today's news in multiple cases. The day before Mike Flynn's disastrous sentencing hearing in December, the day before that went so wrong for him in court, you might also remember that Flynn's business partner, his longtime business partner, a guy named Bijan Kian, was also indicted, also charged with, in his case, acting as an agent of a foreign government. This is sort of a more serious version of the charge that a number of Mueller targets have faced, which is failing to register as a foreign agent. What Bijan Kian was charged with in mid-December is sort of the more serious version of that crime. According to his lawyers, it is something that has only been charged in the United States a handful of times since the law was created. But Bijan Kian pled not guilty. He's not, pleading guilty and agreeing to cooperate like most of the other people who were charged in the Mueller investigation thus far. Kian has pled not guilty. He wants to go to trial. Today there was a hearing in his case to, among other things, set a trial date. Kian's lawyers pleaded with the judge hearing that case in the Eastern District of Virginia that they needed quite a lot more time to prepare their defense before they would feel comfortable proceeding with a trial. And mostly their basis for arguing that today was that there's a ton of evidence to go through in the government's case, what they described as terabytes worth of data on multiple hard drives that they had received from the prosecution outlining their case against Bijan Kian. But one of Kian's lawyers also told the judge today that there was a more personal reason they wanted to delay. They want to delay specifically until this fall. And we got a transcript of that hearing today in which we can see Bijan Kian's lawyer telling the judge today, quote, "I know it is not of utmost concern to the court, Your Honor, but our client's daughter's wedding is the first week of August. So we would like to make sure that we don't jam him up in that regard as well." This lawyer saying that, please, can we put the trial off to the fall? There's so much to do. There's so much evidence to get through. But also, his daughter's wedding is the first week of August. Couldn't we do it after that? The judge responded to that effectively at this hearing today by saying, sorry, when is his daughter's wedding? It's the first week of August? You don't want to, what did you say, jam him up right before that? Okay, then, the judge said, we will set his trial for July 15th. So maybe he can just wear his father of the bride tux to the trial in case that's going to be the closest he gets to celebrating his daughter's wedding the first week in August. On the Concord management case, there was another blunt ruling from a federal judge today in that case. Concord Management, you'll remember, that's the Russian company charged in conjunction with the Internet Research Agency case. This is the indictment brought early on by Mueller, charging a bunch of Russian citizens and the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg and the Russian oligarch who funded and ran that and his management company. They're all charged with conspiring to defraud the United States by interfering with the lawful functions of our election process, among a whole bunch of other crimes, including identity theft. They're basically charging these defendants with having run the social media and propaganda element of the Russian government's interference in our 2016 election to benefit President Trump. Now, none of the Russian defendants in that indictment have set foot in a U.S. courtroom since this indictment was handed down. Russia, as a rule, does not extradite their citizens to stand trial in the United States. But the Russian oligarch who is charged in this indictment, Russian oligarch close to Putin, close to the Russian government, the guy who allegedly runs the Internet Research Agency and ran this part of the operation, he appears to have decided to try to use the U.S. court system against the United States of America, and specifically against the Mueller investigation, by taking materials obtained over the course of that criminal case and disseminating them in Russia in an effort to try to gain intel on what Mueller has figured out about Russian interference. And prosecutors in that case say they've also used the materials obtained in that court case in what amounts to another Russian intelligence operation. an effort to take the case materials from this Concord Management case that the lawyers representing Concord Management in that case have obtained through the American court system. Those materials were obtained through this criminal case, through judicial proceedings in the United States. Those materials then turned up online being shopped by pro-Russia Twitter accounts as supposedly hacked material from the Mueller investigation that they were shopping to U.S. journalists, trying to undermine and discredit what Mueller is doing and what evidence he has found. So this Concord Management case, none of the Russian defendants have turned up in court. For Concord Management, this Russian corporate entity, they did hire American lawyers to represent that Russian entity. They've used those American lawyers basically to obtain information from the Mueller investigation that Russia appears to be turning around in another op intending to target the U.S. public. So that case has definitely taken a bunch of weird turns. This is an odd duck case among all of the Mueller and Mueller-derived investigations we've seen thus far. It's ultimately important to know, though, about this Concord Management case that at every turn, at every incremental step that we have been able to see thus far in this case, Concord Management and their U.S. defense team have lost against Mueller's prosecutors. Everything they fought on, they have lost. Today was no exception. Today, the judge in the Concord Management case issued her order on yet another request by Concord Management that they should get yet more discovery materials as part of this case. The judge ruled flatly no, ruled against them full stop. No, they cannot have those new discovery materials they're asking for. They have lost at every step of this case thus far, including today. That same theme, that same little melody also seems to be applying when it comes to the new case of Roger Stone, the longtime Trump political advisor who was arrested at his home in Florida 2.5 weeks ago. Stone was charged with 7 felony counts for allegedly lying to Congress and witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Roger Stone's lawyers today tried to make the case to the judge hearing the Stone case, tried to tell the court that the prosecutors acted illegally on the day that Roger Stone was arrested. His lawyers told the court today that the indictment, the actual written indictment of Roger Stone, it was illegally sent out to reporters before Roger Stone was arrested, while the indictment was supposed to be still under seal. That was their contention to the judge in the Stone case today. But to back it up, Mr. Stone's lawyers then provided evidence to the court that, in fact, the indictment of Mr. Stone was emailed out to reporters after Stone was arrested. So again, their big allegation to the court today was, hey, this indictment was sent out before Roger Stone was arrested. They then provided written evidence to the court showing that the indictment was sent out after Roger Stone was arrested. So, I mean, that's a little bit like calling in sick to work and then turning in a note from your doctor that says, Rachel's fine. Like, maybe the proof here, supposed proof, didn't help. So it's starting to look like the Roger Stone case is not going all that well either, although there's certainly lots to come. At this point, he's still pleading not guilty, still planning on going to trial. Should be interesting. Now, although this pattern seems to be clear on every legal case that we have seen thus far on the Russia investigation, either directly from Mueller's office or from any of these associated prosecutions, so far we have seen this theme that nobody is faring well when it comes to these legal cases being prosecuted. That said, a lot of these things are still in process. It's obviously not all done. It's obviously not all settled. Even today, there's a bunch of intriguing stuff that isn't yet decided that could go any way at all. For example, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, that's just a court that's just one level below the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, we found out from filings before that court that we're likely to get public access soon to some of the core materials in the mystery case. This is the case that the special counsel's office has been fighting out with an unknown company that is wholly owned by an unknown foreign country. We know the basics about this case. This company owned by a foreign country got a subpoena from Mueller months ago in 2018. They have fought it to the highest levels of the U.S. court system, including some elements of this case that have gone all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Their contention is that they don't have to comply with the subpoena from Mueller, basically because they're owned by a foreign country. But again, like we've seen with all of these cases, as far as we can tell with the mystery case, it appears that at every turn in this court case thus far, they have lost. I mean, they're fighting it out. They're fighting it, as I said, all the way to the Supreme Court in some cases, but they appear to have lost at every stage. As far as we can tell from the heavily redacted filings that we have in the mystery case, the company is now paying $50,000 per day, every day, as punishment for them still refusing to comply with the subpoena because the courts have ruled that they really do need to comply with the subpoena. And, this is a case that has been tied up in incredibly highfalutin litigation for months now. It's still not clear, I guess, in the end, if Mueller's going to get whatever it is he's demanding in this subpoena from this company. But we did find out today that we, the public, are going to have access to more material from that case within the next few weeks, if today's new court filings in that case are anything to go by. We also learned today that this man, Sam Patten, has finally been given a sentencing date. Sam Patten pled guilty last August to failing to register as a foreign agent working on behalf of a pro-Russia political party in Ukraine. He also admitted to prosecutors that he helped a pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarch illegally funnel foreign money into the Trump inaugural committee. Sam Patten pled guilty last August. He became a cooperating witness. What we know of his business past and the filings in his case thus far show that his case and his cooperation may be tied up not only to the Trump inaugural committee, which was just subpoenaed last week by federal prosecutors, but also to Konstantin Kilimnik, with whom he was involved in business relationships. Konstantin Kilimnik is the alleged Russian intelligence figure who himself has been indicted by Mueller on a witness tampering charge. He's central to some of the most intriguing elements of the Paul Manafort prosecution. Sam Patten is tied to Konstantin Kilimnik. Sam Patten is also tied to Cambridge Analytica, which, of course, was the Trump campaign data firm during the election, around which there has been lots and lots of intrigue. We found out today that Sam Patten will finally be sentenced on April 12th. So a couple of months from now, a week in advance of that sentencing, in the first week of April, we will get filings in his case that we expect to detail the extent of his cooperation with federal prosecutors since he pled guilty last summer. Given all of the different elements of this scandal that Sam Patten is potentially connected to, the inaugural, Kilimnik, Cambridge Analytica, it's going to be fascinating to see what he's helped prosecutors with. When he finally turns up in court and his case, which has been totally opaque to us, the public, thus far, gets laid out for the public, we will understand how he fits into this puzzle as well. So there's definitely still stuff that remains to be explained, and that we will eventually learn as members of the public who are watching all of this stuff. There's definitely cases that aren't over, trials that haven't been held, questions that haven't been answered, stuff that hasn't been unredacted and unsealed for public viewing. But even in the middle of all those things, in general, the theme, the melody, is now quite recognizable. I mean, who's won going up against the Mueller investigation or any of the related prosecutions? Who's come out on the long end of the stick, right? I mean, if you had to decide right now which party you would want to be in any of these cases, if you were told, hey, the news gods are going to plop you personally into any of these ongoing cases that derive from the Mueller investigation, would you rather be on the defense side or the prosecution side? What do you think? I mean, in every instance, you would rather be on the prosecution side because of how poorly everybody has come out who has thus far been on the defense. Even people who the special counsel's office has called for lenience about, people like Mike Flynn, when independent federal judges get a look at the evidence and the information supporting these cases, even guys like Mike Flynn aren't turning out well in court. But that theme, which we can hear running through all of these different cases and all of these different stories that broke in today's news, it is loudest and clearest tonight when it comes to the president's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. As you know, Manafort was initially charged with multiple felonies in October 2017. He and Trump's deputy campaign chair, Rick Gates, were then hit with another superseding indictment, another 32 felony counts this time last year, February of 2018. In what was supposed to be the first of his 2 federal felony trials, Manafort was convicted on 8 felonies in the Eastern District of Virginia. He then, in September, changed his mind, and on the eve of the start of his second federal trial, he decided to plead guilty and agree to cooperate with prosecutors rather than go through with that second federal trial. Well, his cooperation deal with prosecutors, we now know, went poorly. Within about 10 weeks of him starting that supposed cooperation deal with prosecutors, the special counsel's office had advised the judge in the Manafort case that Manafort was lying. That Manafort had breached his plea agreement, breached his cooperation agreement, and repeatedly lied to prosecutors on multiple topics. Since the prosecution team told the judge that Manafort had been lying to them in late November, that has been the subject of lots and lots of billable hours and a lot of back and forth involving Manafort's defense team and the prosecution and the judge. There have been tons of filings. There have been multiple hearings. Tonight, the judge in the Manafort case finally issued her ruling on this question of whether or not Manafort lied, whether or not he breached his plea agreement and his cooperation agreement when he lied to prosecutors. And it sounds like a little process thing, but the significance of this is hard to overstate when it comes to Paul Manafort's life, his natural life, and the prospects for what's going to happen in the rest of it. I mean, he's 70 years old. He does not appear to be in great health. He was already looking at maybe 10 years in prison based on the convictions he's already suffered at his first trial. As a cooperating witness, he was clearly hoping to get little to no additional time on the charges that would have been the subject of his second trial. He was presumably also hoping for lenience against the prison sentence he was expecting for his other convictions from his first trial. I mean, we'll get some expert advice on this tonight, but my reading of this ruling tonight is that he can now forget all that. I mean, the judge in the Manafort case tonight seems to have kind of sealed Manafort's fate in an almost existential sense. The judge tonight ruled on two matters. First, she ruled that Manafort did breach the plea agreement. That means the Office of Special Counsel, Mueller's office, is no longer bound by anything they agreed to with him. And that means they can charge him with absolutely everything they believe he has done and they can prove in court. From the judge's ruling tonight, quote, the Office of Special Counsel is no longer bound by its obligations under the plea agreement, including its promise to support a reduction of the offense level in the calculation of the U.S. sentencing guidelines. But then there's a second matter on which the judge rules as well. Quote, but that is not the only question before the court to decide. The question remains whether the defendant made intentionally false statements in connection with the 5 matters that have been identified by the Office of Special Counsel as matters on which Manafort lied to them. Quote, the answer bears upon the applicability of certain provisions of the sentencing guidelines, in particular the adjustment for acceptance of responsibility, and it bears more generally on the court's assessment of the factors set forth in the sentencing statute. So that's the judge saying, this is the part that really is going to have a big impact on how many years I give him. I mean, again, prosecutors say Manafort lied to them on 5 separate issues. What the judge ruled specifically tonight is that on 3 of those 5 issues, she says Manafort didn't just lie, he lied to prosecutors intentionally. These are those matters. Quote, the Office of Special Counsel has established by a preponderance of the evidence that defendant intentionally made false statements to the FBI, the Office of Special Counsel, and the grand jury concerning a $125,000 payment to Manafort, quote, a matter that was material to the investigation. The judge continues. Also, the Office of Special Counsel has established by a preponderance of the evidence that defendant intentionally made multiple false statements to the FBI, the Office of Special Counsel, and the grand jury concerning other matters that were material to the investigation, namely defendant's interactions and communications with Konstantin Kilimnik. The judge also ruled that in some other DOJ investigation that we're not allowed to know what it was about, Manafort once again, quote, intentionally made false statements that were material to the investigation. So, again, we'll get some expert advice on this in just a minute, but I think basically this clears the way for this judge to move ahead with sentencing Paul Manafort. I mean, the combination of him breaching his plea agreement and being found by the judge to have intentionally lied to the prosecutors on matters material to their investigation, that combination implies that from here on out, what Manafort is looking at in his case is no credit for having been a cooperating witness, maybe not even any credit for him pleading guilty, which usually counts in your favor because it shows you've accepted responsibility for your actions. And I think there's a chance that this might also mean that Manafort could be looking at additional felony charges, potentially the reinstatement of the felony charges that the special counsel's office had agreed to drop in exchange for his guilty plea. Potentially they could reinstate the additional 10 felony charges that he faced at his first trial on which the jury was hung, on which they were not able to come to a verdict. I mentioned that he's 70 years old already. So where we are in this as of tonight, where are we in terms of this devastating ruling for the president's campaign chairman? I mean, in terms of Paul Manafort, I think this is a doomsday situation for him in terms of his own fate. Prosecutors have already raised to the judge in his case the prospect that Manafort has been angling for a presidential pardon. They've raised the possibility to the judge that that may explain some of Manafort's behavior thus far, even since he pled guilty and agreed to cooperate. We know from filings in Manafort's case that his behavior, specifically some of his behavior that involved that alleged Russian intelligence figure, Konstantin Kilimnik, in the words of the special counsel's office, that's something that goes right to the heart of the central matter that Robert Mueller is investigating. I mean, stepping back for us just as citizens here, I mean, big picture, everything has gone south for everybody who has been caught up as a defendant in any of these investigations thus far. Nobody has won against Robert Mueller or any of the prosecutors who have brought cases against these defendants in conjunction with the Mueller investigation. Nobody has won. Everything has gone south for every one of those defendants. But for the president's campaign chair specifically, Paul Manafort, things have not just gone south for him. He is now at the South Pole. And if he has just bottomed out in his case, if he has reached the end of the line, if he is staring down the prospect of a sentence long enough to ensure that he dies in federal prison, and if, in fact, there are elements of his case that are central to the core question of the special counsel's investigation, which is Russia's interference in our election and the Trump campaign's involvement in that, then it is starting to feel like we may know what the final collision course is here between this president and the Justice Department, including the special counsel. And as that legal collision takes shape, literally tomorrow morning, they're going to vote in the Senate on Trump's nominee to be the new attorney general. Tomorrow morning is going to be the final confirmation vote on William Barr. William Barr, who was chosen by Trump for the job and who will overtly make no commitment that Mueller's ultimate findings will be made available to Congress, let alone to the public. I mean, Mueller thus far seems to be batting 1,000 in all of the cases brought in association with this scandal. But in some of these cases, and in the Manafort case in particular as of tonight, that means these prosecutions are pushing this to the place where it ends for everybody involved. Central matters at the heart of the investigation, with the cases coming to an end, the defendants having lost in every way and in ways that put their free life in question. Will the Justice Department, will the special counsel's office be allowed to see this all the way through to the end? Will they be allowed to run through the tape? Because in at least one of these central cases, we're there. The acting Attorney General, Matt Whitaker, was just told by the House Judiciary Committee tonight that they believe he may have lied under oath. They want him back to clarify his testimony from last week, specifically about his contact with the White House about prosecutions related to the Russia investigation. The new Attorney General, William Barr, is likely to be confirmed tomorrow morning in the midst of all of this, while this collision is happening. This is not a test. Hold tight.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.